Hello students, Mr. John here. Today we're talking about Chapter 5, Lesson 1, and things are getting rowdy in the colonies. As we read on the previous page, things like tarring and feathering tax collectors, a very brutal process. It's all starting to happen. There's a lot of anger boiling over in the colonies, and really, that's kind of what this whole lesson today is going to be about. It's about the angry colonists. So let's get into it. Our first little subsection here, dealing with Great Britain. So as you may well remember from the last chapter, the relationship between the colonists and their motherland of Britain is already becoming a little strained. Colonists were none too happy about the proclamation of 1763, prohibiting them from expanding too far west. I have this nice picture here. It was a proclamation line. Now, there was also some smuggling going on to avoid British laws and taxes, and this is all about to get worse. The taxes Britain had planned on leaving on the colonists to pay for the French and Indian War they're incoming, and the colonists are having none of it. On top of that, more troops were sent to the colonies to enforce the already existing British laws and taxes. Remember, a bunch were sent over to help enforce the proclamation line, a new tool that tax officials were given to help combat the smuggling problem specifically. It was called a writ of assistance. We learned about it a bit in our vocab lesson. I may have referred to it as sort of like an ultra warrant or super warrant. Basically, it was this piece of paper that a customs officer would have. There we go. I have a piece of paper, and it says on it that they can search anything, anywhere, anytime. So like with a warrant, like here in America, like modern times, they have to have a reason. Say your police officer has to have a reason to want to go search something, and then he has to go to a judge, and then the judge has to grant it. But with this super paper, this writ of assistance, they could just search anywhere, anytime. It was like a super warrant. That's why I call it that. So that's what a writ of assistance was. They didn't really like that. Imagine that the police or whatever authority could just come search anywhere, anytime, and there's nothing you could do about it. I personally wouldn't like some, schlub coming up to my house and being like, I'm doing a search. Why? Because I can. I'd be super mad too, so I can understand why the colonists were mad. So that was a problem too, the writ of assistance. Now, what else were we going to get mad about in the colonies? The Sugar Act. It was passed in 1764, and this tax the act actually lowered the tax on molasses from 6 cents to 3 cents. So they cut it in half in an attempt to get people to stop smuggling. They thought it would be easier for the colonists. They thought that the colonists would think it would be easier to just pay the low tax than trying to smuggle it. But and that's a good theory, but the problem is tacked onto that act was this basically it allowed customs officers to seize smuggled goods without going through the process of court. And that angered many of the colonists, as they believed they had a right to a trial as, English subjects. So it was like, okay, it sounds good, but they tacked a little too much onto it. Now, even more taxes. In 1765, Parliament passed what was called the Stamp Act. This is one of the more famous of the acts that we learn about. This was basically a tax on almost anything printed on paper. That meant newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. Now, when the tax was paid on that good, it received a stamp. Like here's an example of that stamp. And that showed that paper had been taxed already and paid for and was legal. But people were furious about this. Colonial government sent resolutions to Parliament saying that only the colonies could tax the colonies. A Boston group of rabble-rousers who called themselves the Sons of Liberty was created by Samuel Adams around this time. This group coordinated and conducted what one might call street actions, like burning effigies of tax collectors, tarring tax collectors, giving them the old tar and feather treatment we talked about, and staging protests. They were what you might call an activist group. So, and the Sons of Liberty, while it started in Boston, there would be many chapters around the country. So here's that stamp that caused so much trouble. There were also calls on merchants to boycott British goods, basically not buy them. And then the idea is because they lose so much business that they beg the government to stop what they're doing. That's making the buyers angry. So it's basically a way of forcing people to get them to do what you want. The colonists demanded a repeal of the Stamp Act, and the colonists basically got their way on March of 1767 when the Stamp Act was repealed. However, in conjunction with the repeal, Parliament passed what was called the Declaratory Act, saying, "We're repealing this, but you have to listen to us next time. We have the right to tax you." So, kind of a mixed message there. All right. The Stamp Act had been repealed, but Britain still needed revenue from the colonies, so they passed what's called the Townshend Acts in 1767. They thought they could basically circumvent the problems of taxing goods like glass, tea, and paper when they arrived at the colonies instead of once they were actually in the colony. So they wanted to sort of tax the goods at the dock as opposed to once the goods are circulated in the colonies. They thought they would help, and it turned out to be wrong. The colonists went crazy again. There were calls for more boycotts. Women groups like the Daughters of Liberty homespun clothes so folks didn't have to buy clothes from Britain. Britain had a very booming textile industry. We'll learn about that when we do Industrial Revolution. But a lot of clothes came from Britain, were shipped in from Britain. So there were calls for boycotts on things like that. This was basically another well-organized effort to hurt Britain enough into repealing their taxes. The colonists, a lot of them were not big fans. Just a lot of them didn't like paying more for their goods. A lot of the more prominent folk didn't like being taxed without a say in it, because it was Parliament over in Britain levying these taxes, and the colonists didn't have any representation in the Parliament. So that's where you end up with no taxation without representation. All right, let's take a quick look at the assignment for the day. It is a quiz, 10 points. You'll have multiple attempts depending on which section you're in. It looks a little bit like this. Nothing crazy in there. 5 questions. And actually, you have a current event today. So I'm going to put a green arrow here, and you're going to want to move on to your current event assignment because it is Current Event Thursday. All right, I'll fix that. Don't forget to move on to do your current event. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, hey, have a good one, all right?